There was sort of several examples of her being rude to staff. I mean, I heard, that she was rude to the gardener, the under gardener, and the head gardener reported this to the Queen. The Queen got into her car and drove down and ticked her off because you're not to be rude to staff. And what also where I lost it was when this kind of crazy business of Archie being born, and she's the only woman, as far as I know, if you look at the timeline, who gave birth and then subsequently went into labour later in the day.
There are moments in royal history that stop you cold. Moments when a single detail lands with such precision, such devastating specificity, that you suddenly understand everything that came before it in an entirely new light. Moments when the carefully managed public image of a situation cracks just enough for the truth to come flooding through. What you just heard is one of those moments. Because this is not a royal commentator offering an opinion. This is not a tabloid editor reading between the lines. This is Hugo Vickers, one of the most respected royal historians of our generation, a man who spent 6 decades in close proximity to the British monarchy, who met privately with Queen Elizabeth II more than 40 times across 55 years, who has just published what many serious observers are calling the most significant royal book of the decade. And what he is telling us calmly, carefully, with the measured authority of a man who has earned the right to say it, is that Queen Elizabeth II was dealing with things in her final years that most of the public could barely have imagined. She drove down herself. Let that land for a moment. The head of state of the United Kingdom. A woman who had spent 70 years holding this institution together through storms that would have broken lesser constitutions entirely, who navigated the abdication crisis, the death of a beloved husband, 2 world wars worth of national grief, and in her final years in the time that should, by any reasonable measure, have been her quiet and well-deserved reward, she was personally getting into her car and driving to wherever Meghan happened to be, to tell her face to face that she was not to speak to the staff that way. Not in her household, not in her family, not on her watch. Think about what that image tells us. Not just about Meghan and the behaviour that made it necessary, but about the Queen, about her extraordinary patience, her deep personal commitment to the standards she had upheld her entire life, and the toll it must have taken on a woman of her age and dignity to deal with something so thoroughly beneath her. The indignity of it is almost impossible to process. And then there is the matter of Archie, a birth story so strange, so riddled with inconsistencies, that even a man as measured and careful in his language as Hugo Vickers cannot move past it without comment. The timeline does not add up. The location was misrepresented. And Hugo Vickers, a man who would never put something in print that he could not stand behind, says so plainly, publicly, and on the record. Today we are going into everything. The private conversations, the Queen's unguarded opinions, the physical toll of those final years, the lady-in-waiting who was stationed for reasons that should make your blood run cold, the Oprah interview and what Hugo Vickers knows about what was happening in that hospital at the very same moment, and the single word he uses for what Meghan chose to do during the reign of the Queen, a word that carries the full weight of 60 years of royal observation behind it. That word is unforgivable. And by the time we are done today, you will understand exactly why he means it. Before we go any further, we need to understand exactly who Hugo Vickers is, and why this book carries the weight that it does. It would be dangerously easy to hear these revelations and file them alongside the endless stream of royal commentary that has flooded our screens in recent years. It would be easy to assume this is simply another voice adding to the noise. It is anything but. Hugo Vickers has been described, with some justification, as one of our generation's foremost historians specialising in the British royal family. His book, Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, is the product of 60 years of the most personal observation and the most detailed research any living historian has brought to bear on this subject. He had over 40 private meetings with the late Queen, the first in 1968, when she was still in the early decades of her reign, the last stretching into the very final years of her extraordinary life. Over those 5.5 decades, he became one of the most trusted confidants of the royal court. This is not a man repeating second-hand gossip. This is a man who was, in many of the most important moments of recent royal history, in the room.
What I was sad about was that, the Queen did have this absolutely fantastic reign of 70 years. And at the time of her Platinum Jubilee, she should have been sort of sailing into sunlit uplands. And instead of which she had problems of Prince Harry and Meghan. She had problems with the government, with Brexit and all those things, and her health, obviously, and Prince Andrew and things like that. And it was very sad that the last years were rather sort of overshadowed by that.
Sailing into sunlit uplands. What a phrase, and what a devastating contrast to what actually happened. Here is a woman who had given 70 years of unbroken, unbending service to this country and this institution. She had been there for every crisis, every coronation, every moment of national joy and national grief. She had delivered speeches during wartime as a child, buried a husband she had loved for more than 70 years, and kept going day after day, engagement after engagement, with a steadiness and grace that the rest of the world could only marvel at from a distance. And as the Platinum Jubilee arrived, as the nation gathered to celebrate her, as the bunting went up and the crowds filled the streets and the whole country paused to reflect on 7 extraordinary decades of service, she was not sailing into anything resembling sunlit uplands. She was managing Harry. She was managing Meghan. She was managing the slow and toxic fallout from an Oprah Winfrey interview that had gone off like a grenade in the middle of a family she had spent her entire adult life protecting. Hugo Vickers writes in his book that the distress Harry and Meghan caused the Queen in her final years cannot be overstated. Should not be understated. Cannot be overstated. That is a historian's careful, deliberately chosen language for something that was genuinely extreme. And it is against that backdrop, against the image of an elderly woman trying to celebrate the greatest achievement of her remarkable life, while managing something that should never have been hers to manage, that everything else in this story must be understood. What makes Hugo Vickers' account so powerful is not just what he says, but how he says it. He is not a man who reaches for superlatives. He does not deal in drama for its own sake. He is measured, scholarly, precise, which is exactly why, when he uses words like devastating, unforgivable, and shocking, the impact is so much greater than if those words had come from anyone else. He has spent a lifetime earning the credibility to say them, and he is saying them now. For years, the public narrative around the early days of Harry and Meghan's relationship has been carefully constructed and even more carefully maintained. The story sold to the world most aggressively by Harry himself in his memoir was of a family that rejected Meghan from the very beginning, that treated her with suspicion and coldness. That left her isolated and without support. William, in particular, was cast as the principal villain, the overprotective older brother who urged caution where caution was not wanted. Harry devoted significant portions of his memoir to painting William as the source of much of Meghan's unhappiness in those early years, and William, with characteristic dignity, said nothing publicly in response. Hugo Vickers' book dismantles that narrative quietly, methodically, and completely.
It wasn't just William who had nervousness about Meghan, it was Charles and the Queen too.
I think what you'll find is that almost certainly, and listen, this is just speculation on my part, is that Prince Harry will have told Meghan Markle what members of his family said. And that, of course, will never be forgiven. If he said, look, William has said, steady on or something, she'll have held that against him.
Read that back slowly and let it land. It was not just William. It was Charles then, the Prince of Wales, the future king who took the line that Lord Mountbatten had once taken with him before he began courting Princess Diana. Have fun, but do not marry her. The same counsel, given a generation later, to a prince standing at what appeared to be a similar crossroads. The family had been here before. They knew what it looked like when a royal marriage was entered into too quickly, too passionately, without the proper weight of consideration. And then there was the Queen herself. Not a courtier, not an aide the Queen. She suggested Harry should wait a year, not a rejection. Not a pronouncement against Meghan as a person, simply, take your time, be certain. It was the advice of a woman who had spent 70 years watching what happened when royals made decisions from passion rather than from wisdom, and who understood better than anyone alive what a wrong choice in this arena could look like. 3 generations of the royal family, grandmother, father, brother, all, independently, had reservations. All urged caution, and Harry, it seems, told Meghan all of it. Every private word of concern, every carefully expressed hesitation, every quiet suggestion that perhaps more time was needed. He handed her the full account of what his family had said before the ring was even on her finger, and Meghan, being Meghan, filed every word away. As Hugo Vickers notes with quiet precision, that, of course, will never be forgiven.
Meghan was warmly welcomed in Britain, that everyone in the royal family tried their very, very hardest to make her feel at home and accommodate her, but that unfortunately Meghan only wanted to be the star and made it impossible for her and the royal family to collaborate.
The goodwill was real, genuine, and by all credible accounts, extraordinary. Hugo Vickers describes the atmosphere in Windsor on the day of the wedding, the crowds, the warmth, the remarkable outpouring of public affection for this woman joining one of the most storied families in the world. The British public wanted her to succeed. The royal family showed up and gave the marriage every expression of support the occasion demanded. Those present speak of a feeling that something new and perhaps genuinely wonderful was beginning. What happened in the months and years that followed tells us everything we need to know about the person at the centre of this story. And it is a telling that Hugo Vickers, with his 60 years of evidence, is now making with very careful and very deliberate precision. It did not take long. Reports of difficulties with staff began circulating almost immediately, quietly at first, in the way things always circulate quietly in royal circles before finding their way into the wider world. There were murmurs, whispered exchanges between people who worked in the household, the kind of conversations that happen when something is wrong and everyone can see it but no one quite knows what to do about it. But Hugo Vickers heard more than murmurs. With 60 years of connections inside the palace and the royal household, he heard things that went considerably further than anything that had made it into the press. And what he describes is not a woman struggling to adapt to an unfamiliar environment. What he describes is a pattern of behaviour that was, from very early on, causing serious concern to the people closest to the Queen. And then there is the gardener incident. Hugo Vickers recounts it almost in passing as a single item in a longer list of evidence he has been quietly accumulating. But stop on it, sit with it. Because what this detail tells us about the dynamic that had developed between Meghan and the Queen is, when you really think about it, quite extraordinary. Meghan was rude to the gardener, not just the head gardener, the under gardener, the person at the very bottom of the household hierarchy, the person who had no power, no recourse, no ability to answer back. And the head gardener understanding, as all royal household staff instinctively understand, the correct and proper way these things are handled, reported it, up the chain of command, all the way to the Queen. And the Queen, who was managing a global pandemic, the frightening decline of Prince Philip's health, and the ongoing fallout from the Sussex situation, got into her car and drove down herself, personally, to look Meghan in the eye and deliver the message that in this family, you do not treat the people who serve you with anything less than courtesy and respect. Can you imagine the scene? Can you fully absorb what it means that this was necessary? Can you imagine being a grown woman, a former actress, someone who had built an entire public identity around compassion and kindness, and being called personally to account by the most respected woman in the world for being unkind to the person who tended the garden? The sheer audacity of the behaviour that made that conversation necessary is something that Hugo Vickers, for all his scholarly restraint, clearly finds impossible to set aside. And honestly, so do I.
He had to go into hospital, and so off he went. And yes, they did really nearly lose him twice. And as you know, he then eventually came back to Windsor Castle, but it took a long time to get him back because the nurses had to be absolutely COVID-free. That was the point. And so they had to be isolated and so forth. And for this interview to go ahead at this particular moment, and as we know, in retrospect, of course, he died very soon afterwards. Well, I think that's very shocking.
Very shocking. 2 words. From a man who has spent 60 years in the company of the most significant figures in British public life. A man who has seen things that most of us will never see, and knows things that most of us will never know. And the words he reaches for, when he tries to describe what Harry and Meghan chose to do while Prince Philip lay in a hospital bed, are these. Very shocking. Let us be absolutely clear about what Hugo Vickers is telling us. Prince Philip was in hospital. His medical team had nearly lost him not once but twice. The man who had spent more than 7 decades as the Queen's most constant companion Her anchor through every storm of her extraordinary reign was fighting for his life in a way that the public was not being told about. The nurses who would care for him when he was well enough to return to Windsor Castle had to be placed in isolation first to ensure they were completely COVID-free. That is the medical and human context into which Harry and Meghan chose to insert an Oprah Winfrey interview containing accusations of racism against the royal family. False accusations, as Hugo Vickers makes clear, carefully constructed, expertly timed, devastatingly delivered accusations that the royal family could not immediately and publicly dismantle out of dignity, out of respect for an institution bigger than any individual within it, even though they knew perfectly well that much of what was being said was untrue. The trap was expertly laid. The two issues raised race and mental health made it almost impossible to push back without appearing to be exactly the kind of institution the interview was claiming you were. And so the palace issued its careful, now legendary four-word response: recollections may vary, and the Queen had to live with the consequences. Prince Philip came home to Windsor Castle and died very soon afterwards. He never saw the full scope of what was said about his family that evening. He never had to watch the clips on morning television or hear commentators around the world weighing in on whether the institution he had dedicated his adult life to was as rotten as the woman his grandson had married was claiming. In some small mercy, that is perhaps something, but only barely, because the Queen saw all of it. The Queen lived through all of it, and she did so as she did everything without complaint, without drama, without ever once losing the composure that had been the defining characteristic of her 70-year reign. But what it cost her to maintain that composure is a question that Hugo Vickers, in his book, is not prepared to leave unasked.
Now Harry has opted out. And for what? To be a carer for Archie. So it sounds like she had almost a bit of a premonition that this life in California wasn't going to work out for her grandson. The Queen herself suggested that Harry should wait a year. So it wasn't just William who had nervousness about Meghan. It was Charles and the Queen too.
A carer for Archie. Those were the Queen's words, or words very close to them, captured by Hugo Vickers and now sitting on the record for the world to read. Harry, who had been Captain General of the Royal Marines. Harry, who had served 2 tours of Afghanistan and flown Apache helicopters in combat. Harry, who had been one of the most popular members of the royal family, whose approval ratings at certain moments exceeded even the Queen's own. That Harry, sitting barefoot under a tree in California. A carer for Archie. The Queen, it seems, had looked at what was being proposed, this vague, half-formed, fundamentally dishonest plan to be half in and half out of royal life, to trade on the prestige of the crown while escaping the duties that gave that prestige its meaning, and she had understood, with the clarity that only 7 decades of experience could produce, exactly how it was going to end, not as promised, not as presented, not well. Hugo Vickers draws a comparison that is almost unbearably poignant. The Queen's own father, George VI, had been forced to opt in after the abdication, to pick up the most demanding role in the country with no training, simply because his brother had walked away. George VI, who had not wanted the throne, who had a stammer and a fierce anxiety about public life, and who nonetheless showed up every single day without complaint because duty demanded it. He carried it until the day he died. The Queen learned what service meant from watching her father carry something he had never asked for, and never once put down. And then there is Harry, who was trained, who was supported, who was loved and given every possible opportunity to build something meaningful and lasting, and who chose California. The contrast is not subtle, and Hugo Vickers does not pretend that it is. What is so striking about Hugo Vickers' account? What elevates it above the level of royal gossip and into something historically significant is not any single revelation in isolation. It is the cumulative portrait that emerges when you place all the pieces side by side and step back to look at the whole. Because this is not the story of a woman who found royal life difficult and struggled to adapt. It is not the story of a sensitive soul crushed by an unfeeling institution. It is the story of a woman who had decided, very early on, that the institution would adapt to her, and when it became clear that it would not, she burned it down on her way out.
She was kind of had her own agenda, but what I didn't think she would do is to, I never thought she'd stay, to be honest, but I never thought she'd do it in the reign of the Queen, but she was prepared to do that. That's what I find unforgivable. That's why I make those remarks.
Unforgivable. He says it plainly, this careful, precise, thoroughly measured historian who has spent 6 decades choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who understands that words, once spoken, cannot be recalled. He does not say regrettable. He does not say unfortunate. He says unforgivable, and he means it. Because there is a distinction that Hugo Vickers understands better than almost anyone between leaving and what Meghan chose to do during the leaving. He acknowledges, with characteristic fairness, that he had always thought she would eventually go, that her temperament and ambitions made departure, at some point, essentially inevitable. He had seen it coming, but he had not expected the timing. He had not expected that she would choose to blow it up so thoroughly and so publicly while the Queen was still alive to live through the wreckage. And then there is the Archie birth story, which Hugo Vickers cannot quite move past. He describes it with the detached puzzlement of a man confronting something that simply does not add up. The timeline is extraordinary. The location was not as reported. The time was not as reported. The godparents were kept secret in a way that served no legitimate purpose. And the birth itself, that astonishing claim about the timeline that Hugo Vickers raises and then leaves sitting there, quiet and unanswered for the reader to consider.
The truth about Meghan is she will always find a way in which she thinks she can win. And the casualties are irrelevant, whether it's her father, her old best friends, her first husband. There always will be casualties in her life. The question is, when will Harry become the casualty?
The casualties are irrelevant. Think about who has been left behind in the course of Meghan's journey to where she is now. Her father, Thomas Markle, publicly humiliated and frozen out with a thoroughness that shocked even people who consider themselves beyond being shocked. Her oldest friends, the women who knew her before the fame, quietly dropped as her ambitions expanded. Her first husband, Trevor Engelson, discarded with a casualness those who knew him found difficult to comprehend. And now, at the end of that long list, a grandmother-in-law who spent the final years of her extraordinary life managing the consequences of a woman who had decided her own agenda mattered more than any of them. It would be tempting to place all of this entirely at Meghan's feet. She is the one who came in from outside. She is the one whose behaviour caused the Queen to get into her car. She is the one who sat across from Oprah and made claims that Hugo Vickers describes as absolutely untrue. She is the one who had, in his word, her own agenda. But Hugo Vickers is too honest a historian to allow Harry to disappear into the background of this story, as though he was simply a bystander who wandered into a situation he did not understand. Harry is not a bystander. Harry made choices, active, deliberate, eyes-open choices. And those choices had consequences for his family, for the institution, and most painfully of all, for the most important woman in his life.
Harry's been brainwashed by Meghan. Who could disagree? Since they got married, he suddenly hates his country, hates his family, hates being a royal, and goes off for a very boring life in California. This is not a marriage. This is a hostage situation.
Hugo Vickers remembers picking up a celebrity magazine at some point. He noticed it, saw Prince Harry on the cover, smiling and happy and relaxed, then looked at the date, 2015, before the wedding, before California, before all of the years of deliberate, sustained, carefully targeted damage. And the contrast between that image and the man the world sees today is, in his quiet and rather devastating observation, quite something. He doesn't look happy now. That 2015 Harry matters, because it is a reminder of what was actually at stake. Hugo Vickers describes seeing Harry in Commonwealth territories, playing cricket with children, playing football, being mobbed with genuine warmth and affection. He was sometimes more popular than the Queen herself. His approval ratings, at certain moments, exceeded hers, which, given who she was, is a genuinely extraordinary thing to say about anyone. The world wanted that Harry to flourish, to grow into the role his popularity suggested he could hold with real distinction, to become the version of himself that seemed, in 2015, entirely within reach. Instead, he told Meghan what his family had said about her in private. He stood next to her in front of Oprah's cameras while his grandfather lay in hospital. He put his name on a memoir that named names and reopened wounds, and left members of his family with no dignified way to respond. He moved to California, where he sits now at 41, his career stalled, his finances under pressure, his relationship with the family that loved him in ruins. A very long way from the smiling man on the cover of that magazine in 2015, Hugo Vickers is too rigorous a historian to attribute everything in this story to malice and leave it at that. He understands that motivations are complex, and the story of what happened between the Sussexes and the royal family cannot be reduced to a single explanation. But he is also too honest and too knowledgeable to pretend that what was happening was simply a series of unfortunate misunderstandings between people who fundamentally wished each other well. There was a strategy, there was an agenda, and the woman who had sat on the throne for 70 years, who had spent those decades reading the intentions of prime ministers and presidents from every corner of the world, could see it with complete clarity.
Their track record for sort of exploiting the Queen was such that, she used to have her lady-in-waiting present when they came and brought the children, stop them taking photographs which they could subsequently use.
Read that back carefully. The Queen of the United Kingdom had to station her lady-in-waiting, one of her most trusted personal attendants, specifically to prevent her own grandson and his wife from taking photographs during family visits with the children. Photographs that, if taken, would subsequently be used for the purpose of managing a public image, for the purpose of demonstrating a closeness to the crown that the actual reality of the relationship did not support. The word exploit is Hugo Vickers' word. It is the precise and considered word of a man who has thought carefully about what he is describing and chosen the most accurate term available. The Queen was being exploited. The visits of a grandmother with her grandchildren, a private, intimate, fundamentally human thing, were being converted into content. And the Queen, who understood exactly what was happening, had to take measures to protect herself from it. Within her own family, Hugo Vickers also makes clear that the courtiers who served the Queen in those final years were actively working to limit Harry's access to her, not out of politics or animosity, but out of a genuine understanding that as a grandmother, the Queen was uniquely vulnerable to being handled. She was the one person most likely, if left alone with her grandson, to soften, to accommodate, to say never mind about all of that. And the people who served her understood that loving instinct was precisely the vulnerability being targeted. So they worked, as carefully and quietly as they could, to protect her from it. The question of whether they succeeded is one that Hugo Vickers' book addresses with considerable sadness. The Oprah interview deserves its own sustained examination, because it remains the single most consequential thing Harry and Meghan did during the Queen's lifetime. And because Hugo Vickers, with 60 years of intimate knowledge of this family, is better placed than almost any living person to assess how much of what was said that evening bore any relationship to the truth.
Those two cards she played, as we now know, quite a lot of what she said was absolutely untrue. And I think it's, there was a disgraceful exercise altogether.
Absolutely untrue. A disgraceful exercise altogether. He does not hedge these words. He does not surround them with qualifications or diplomatic distancing. He is a historian giving his assessment of the record, and his assessment is clear. Much of what was said in that interview was not true, and the manner in which it was said, the timing, the framing, the deliberate deployment of issues that made honest scrutiny almost impossible was, in his considered judgment, a disgrace. Hugo Vickers is generous enough to acknowledge the difficulty of the moment. He understands that commentators who questioned the interview's claims were taking real professional risks. The two issues Meghan raised, race and mental health, were essentially beyond challenge in that media environment. To push back was to appear to be exactly the kind of person the interview was suggesting you were. And so a lot of people who knew perfectly well that things did not add up stayed quiet. Careers were damaged. Reputations were questioned. The chilling effect on honest journalism in that period was profound and real. But time, as it always does, has a way of revealing what was actually true. The contradictions have accumulated. The inconsistencies have multiplied. The accounts of people who were present for the events being described have painted a very different picture from the one constructed in front of Oprah's cameras. The Queen's response, recollections may vary. 4 words now quite legendary in royal circles, was as measured and dignified as everything else she ever said publicly. But Hugo Vickers makes clear she knew exactly what had been said and how much of it was false. And she spent the remaining months of her life knowing it, while maintaining, as she always had, the composure that the institution demanded, and that she had never, in 70 years, surrendered. Here is the part of this story that is hardest to discuss with the directness it deserves. But Hugo Vickers discusses it anyway because historians do not flinch from difficult truths, simply because they are uncomfortable. The difficult truth he raises gently, with appropriate caveats, but refuses to walk back from, is the question of what those final years of stress and upheaval actually cost Queen Elizabeth II, in the most personal and physical sense of that word.
It's very hard to say, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, they can't have done good. You know, they certainly didn't help matters. Let's put it like that. And I think, you know, stress is very difficult, and it's just rather sad because I think, you know, while we were all celebrating her, she had all these things going on in the background.
They certainly didn't help matters. He will not go further than that, and it would be wrong to push him to. He is too responsible a historian to make a direct causal claim that cannot be definitively proven. But he will not let the question go unasked. He raises it plainly. He leaves it on the page. And in doing so, he invites the reader to sit with a thought that is genuinely difficult and genuinely important. He offers his theory about the trajectory of the Queen's decline after Philip's passing. She handled the immediate aftermath with remarkable resilience. At nearly 95, she did not retreat into mourning. She kept going, because he believes if she had retreated, she might have found it very difficult to return. But then the summer came, and when she came back from Scotland, something had changed. She looked, in Hugo Vickers' telling, terrible. And what had been a slow and manageable decline began to accelerate in ways that frightened those closest to her. He points to one small but telling detail. On the 1st of January, in that final year of her life, the Queen quietly appointed Camilla to the Order of the Garter and Tony Blair when Garter appointments are normally announced in April. The decision was made in January because those who served her most closely were not confident she would survive until then. They were managing her diary and her legacy around the realistic possibility of her imminent death. And all the while, even then, even in those final months, Harry and Meghan were making demands of an elderly woman who was, quietly and privately, running out of time. What is genuinely remarkable about the way the palace handled all of this, the staff complaints, the Oprah interview, the endless demands, the exploitation of family visits, the ongoing media management from California, is the sheer volume of it that was simply absorbed, quietly, professionally, without the kind of public response the situation might otherwise have warranted. Because the Queen and the institution she embodied understood something that Harry and Meghan, for all their media sophistication, never quite grasped. The Crown does not engage. The Crown endures.
The late Queen knew. She knew Harry and Meghan had to be treated toughly. And that's why she said absolutely no half-in, half-out arrangement. And I think this is why the Queen was right.
The Queen was right. It is worth saying that plainly and without qualification. The half-in, half-out arrangement Harry and Meghan proposed keeping the titles, the prestige, the brand value of the Crown, while shedding the duties and accountability that gave those things their legitimacy, was never workable. It was a fundamentally dishonest proposition dressed in the language of personal freedom and mental health. And the Queen, drawing on 70 years of experience managing exactly this kind of situation, looked at it, understood it for what it was, and said no, clearly, definitively, no. Hugo Vickers makes clear that the courtiers who served the Queen were actively working to shield her from the full weight of what was being demanded, limiting access, managing communications, trying to ensure the grandmother in her did not override the sovereign. They understood that the institution is larger than any individual within it, and that its integrity must be protected even, and perhaps especially, when threats come from inside the family. And the Queen herself understood this more clearly than anyone. She had learned it from her father, who had watched his brother choose personal happiness over institutional duty, and spent the rest of his life picking up the pieces of that choice. She had spent 70 years making the opposite decision, every single day, without complaint. In the end, even she could not prevent what happened. But she handled it with the grace and the firmness the situation required, and history will remember that. There is a moment in Hugo Vickers' account where he steps back from the specific details and says something that carries the full weight of everything that has come before it. He says he had always thought she would eventually leave. That was not the surprise. What he had not anticipated, what he finds in his word unforgivable, was that she was prepared to do it during the reign of the Queen, while the Queen was alive. While the Queen still had to read the headlines and manage the fallout and sit through the Platinum Jubilee with this shadow hanging over everything. Why does the timing matter so much? Because it is the timing that tells us most clearly about the character of the person behind it. It is one thing to decide you cannot continue in a role that does not suit you, but to make that decision and execute it in the most damaging possible way, at the most damaging possible moment, in full knowledge of the impact it would have on an elderly woman who had never been anything but loyal to you, that is something different. That reveals something, and what it reveals is not comfortable.
Harry and Meghan should be shaking in their boots right now if they are not already. And they could have had the best of all worlds if they had played their cards right. But this was a route Harry and Meghan decided to go down where they trashed their family, and this is the result.
They could have had everything. That is the part of this story that is most genuinely difficult to understand. Harry was loved genuinely, warmly, sometimes overwhelmingly. He had a platform and a purpose and a level of goodwill that most people on the planet could not conceive of. And Meghan, arriving into that world with all the public hope the wedding had generated, she could have built something truly extraordinary, something lasting and meaningful and worthy of the position she had been given. Instead, they chose the path that led here, the book, the interviews, the lawsuits and documentaries, and the endless cycle of grievance and revelation and accusation that has left them in California with their projects underperforming, their finances under strain, and their relationship with the family they left in a state of irreparable damage. Hugo Vickers saw where this was heading. The Queen, it seems, saw where this was heading. And the rest of us have watched it arrive, step by painful step, in real time. Queen Elizabeth II is gone now. The woman who was the centre of this story, who endured its worst chapters with such extraordinary dignity, who held the door open even when everything she knew about human nature told her exactly what would walk through it, has passed. The institution she spent her entire life building has moved on into the hands of a new generation, carrying all the complications and unresolved questions that the Sussex chapter of royal history left behind. And those questions have not become simpler with time. If anything, they have sharpened, because the Queen's presence, her unique, irreplaceable authority, was the thing that held certain possibilities open. She was the one relationship, the one thread, that might conceivably have drawn Harry back to something resembling the family he left. Her death closed a door, not just for Harry and the family personally, but for the broader story of whether any of this was ever going to resolve itself into something other than permanent, irreconcilable estrangement.
My understanding is that there are members of the family who are very aware of the fact that the marriage is problematic.
The family knows. Of course they know. They have always known. Hugo Vickers' book makes clear the awareness was there from the very beginning. The reservations expressed before the wedding, the lady-in-waiting stationed during family visits, the courtiers carefully managing Harry's access to protect a grandmother who loved him too much to fully protect herself. The knowledge has never been the problem. The problem has always been what to do with it, given the very public and very permanent nature of the choices that have been made. What the Queen's absence means for that calculation is still unfolding. King Charles, William both navigating this without the anchor she provided, without her extraordinary capacity to hold things together through sheer force of dignity and experience. And Harry and Meghan, from their base in California, continue to circle, continue to give interviews, continue to manage a narrative that has, with every passing month, become more difficult to sustain against the weight of the evidence that books like Hugo Vickers are placing on the public record. The story is not over, but the terms on which it will eventually resolve have changed, fundamentally and perhaps permanently, with the Queen's passing. And the person who bears the greatest responsibility for ensuring her final years were harder than they needed to be is the same person who is now, from a comfortable distance, continuing to shape her legacy in ways she never would have sanctioned and never would have chosen. Step back from all the specific details for a moment. Step back from the gardener and the lady-in-waiting and the Oprah interview and the hospital and the birth timeline and the photographs. Step back and look at what Hugo Vickers' book is actually telling us about the Second Elizabethan age and how it ended. It is telling us that one of the greatest monarchs in British history, perhaps the greatest, as Hugo Vickers himself believes, spent the final years of her extraordinary reign managing the consequences of a decision made by her grandson and the woman he married. It is telling us that the Platinum Jubilee, which should have been a pure and uncomplicated celebration of 70 years of selfless service, had this vast and thoroughly unearned shadow hanging over it, and that the woman at the centre of the celebration had to carry the weight of that shadow while smiling for the cameras and waving to the crowds. It is telling us that the distress caused cannot be overstated, and those are not tabloid words. Those are a historian's words, chosen with full awareness of their gravity. Hugo Vickers is unequivocal about his view of Queen Elizabeth II's place in history. He believes she was the greatest monarch this country has produced, that the country was, as he says, extraordinarily lucky to have her for as long as it did. He acknowledges the competition from the First Elizabeth and from Victoria, but his assessment is clear and considered, and based on 60 years of the most personal and detailed observation of this institution that any living historian has been able to conduct. But he also believes, and says so plainly, in print, for the historical record, that her final years were harder than they should have been, that a woman who had given everything she had, for longer than most of us have been alive, deserved better from the people closest to her. That what was done to her in those years, not through one dramatic act, but through an accumulation of choices and demands and betrayals that wore away at something precious and irreplaceable, was not acceptable, was not forgivable, was not, in the judgment of a man who spent 6 decades in the company of this institution, something that history should allow to pass without comment. Queen Elizabeth II deserved her sunlit uplands. She earned them, completely and without question, across 7 decades of service that this country will not see the like of again. She did not get them. And now, finally, carefully, and with the kind of authority that can only come from 60 years of the closest possible observation, the full account of why is being told. Hugo Vickers has made sure of that. And frankly, it was long overdue. Hugo Vickers has given us something genuinely rare and genuinely important with this book. Not just another layer of royal commentary, not just another set of opinions offered from a comfortable distance, but a first-hand, 60-year account of what life inside and alongside this institution actually looked like, and what the final chapter of the Queen's reign cost her, in ways that the public was never fully allowed to see at the time. And it leaves me with a question that I suspect many of you have been sitting with throughout this video. Do you think the Queen ever truly made her peace with what Harry allowed to happen during her lifetime? Not with the leaving itself. She had, it seems, anticipated that in some form, but with the timing of it, with the Oprah interview that went ahead while Prince Philip was fighting for his life, with the memoir published while the family was still raw and the wounds were still open, with the years of management and quiet endurance that were added to the final chapter of a reign that should have been allowed to close in peace and dignity. Do you think she found forgiveness for that? Or is that one of the things she carried, unresolved, to the very end? And here is the other question I keep returning to. Archie is now 7 years old. Lilibet is 4. They are growing up in California, largely shielded from the world, in a household that has made choices that will shape the rest of their lives in ways they are nowhere near old enough to understand yet. What will they think when they are old enough to read the books and watch the interviews and understand what was done in their names? What will they think of the great-grandmother they will never really know, and of the choices that ensured they wouldn't? These are not comfortable questions, but they are, I think, the right ones. And Hugo Vickers, in writing this book, has made sure that they cannot be avoided. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I mean that genuinely, your loyalty to this channel and your willingness to engage seriously with these stories means more than I can adequately express. If this video gave you something to think about, please do give it a like. It costs you nothing and it makes an enormous difference to how many people find this kind of content. If you are not already subscribed, now is the perfect moment. Hit that button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video, And if you know someone who cares about this story and would want to hear what Hugo Vickers has to say, please share it with them, because this channel deserves the widest possible audience. And so does the Queen, whose story it finally, honestly tells.